right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpenka, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the virtual launch of Who Gets In? An Immigration Story by Norman Ravvin and published by University of Regina Press. Thank you to Norman for being with us tonight and to our special guest host, Aritha van Herk, for joining us as well. Norman Ravvin is the award-winning author of The Girl Who Stole Everything, Hidden Canada, An Intimate Travelogue, and A House of Words, Jewish Writing, Identity, and Memory. Born in Calgary, he now lives in Montreal, Quebec. Aritha van Herk is a writer, critic, editor, public intellectual, and university professor based in Alberta. I will now turn things over to Aritha. Please give her a virtual warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. We're going to have a conversation, but this amazing book, Who Gets In, is complex and inspiring and completely absorbing. So Norman, I think you're going to give us a kind of outline and read for 10, 15 minutes before we proceed with our conversation.
Right. Okay, thanks, Aritha. So I'll tell you that in the month that the book has been out, so it's still a pretty new baby. I've had the opportunity, nice opportunities to talk about it, try to convey its unique character, and then this online approach presents new challenges. So it's good for us. And I do have some images to show, but I don't want to hide behind the sharing very much. So we'll let them come up just here and there. And then, of course, Aritha will help later on with some really provocative questions. So the key things that I should tell you at the outset before I just read a little bit are that it's a book about an immigration story, a very kind of singular one and a personal one. So this is something that's shows up in a lot of my work, whether fiction or nonfiction. That is, I run with a family story. And this is a family story that I let be for a very long time, and I don't exactly know why that was the case. And it's of my mother's father, so my grandfather, who came to Canada from central Poland in 1930, which was a time when you could get to this country as a single Jewish man, but you could not really get in with your family, except for in some very unusual circumstances. So he lied to the Canadian government, probably by the advice of his brother, who already lived in Vancouver, and came as a single man. And in that way, he left behind a full life. He left behind a big circle of family. He was somebody who had been very rooted in place in a small village, which I'll show you an image of in a sec, and also in a kind of a small city. And included in the people he left behind were his young wife. They'd only been married something like 2 years, and small children. Maybe I just misspoke on the time that they'd been married. But here's the cover. So I'll just go away for a bit. Everything visible? You see my cover? My grandfather, prior to his marriage, just a quick look at how he looked as a young man. The family left behind, my grandmother and the two children that were, in one case, in my mom's case, tiny. And then just quickly, so that you could get an idea of the kind of place where he left them. They lived in part in this village, which is a kind of an archetypal Jewish-Polish place, about an hour by car from Warsaw. And you get a nice view of the big basilica. The place was well suited out. And then opposite on the square is a red brick building, and that's the synagogue. So you get a sense from that photograph of how these little places operated and what people's daily lives were like. And I'll stop it and come back. Am I back? So one of the special things then about this book is the voice, and Aritha has lots of good thoughts on that. I'll just read you a short section from very early on that both, I think, kind of conveys the voice and also describes my grandfather. So you get a sense of who we're thinking of as we launch into what his narrative was upon coming to Canada. Who is our young man? I might begin by calling him Z, because of the Kafkaesque quality of his struggle, and then because in his efforts he was always the littlest of men, seemingly unaware of his vulnerability and lack of influence, at the end of a lineup of powerful players who, on a whim, could simply ignore or reject his requests. But also because Z he was to me, as in Zeta, though I knew him only in my first years and have no memory of him, not formed by other people's conversations or photographs. There is one snapshot of him from my childhood that I particularly liked. He's seated holding me. I'm 2 years old, laughing open-mouthed in the way that 2-year-olds do. We are in a room that many years later I would know well on Willow Street in Vancouver's Fairview Slopes, where Jews bought houses in the wartime. In the room with its paned east-facing windows, there were books, including a tall leather-bound set of the Talmud printed in 19th century Lemberg, a console record player which held hardcover folders of 78s. Some of them were popular records, but others were of cantorial music, Kusevitsky and Rosenblatt. My grandfather put them on, I'm told, and sang along, facing the window. This sounds like ethnic melodrama, but that was Z, whose story now seems as timely as any as I could tell. So to do Aritha a favor, because she hasn't seen the photo that I'm talking about, it's a rare artifact I refer to that's not in the book. A lot of the things that I'm showing you are, in fact, in the book. So let me just do a quick look for that. And am I up? Radzanov back. There we are. And that's all you get. So let me lose that. Okay. So what my grandfather confronts upon his arrival as a, in quotes, single man in Canada in 1930 is a very rigorous, exclusive immigration regime. And the one thing that you may know about this territory in terms of Canadian history is that there is a book about 35 forward and this problem, this immigration problem called None is Too Many. But my approach to this happens to fall outside of the rubric of that book for all kinds of reasons. Some of those have to do with the prairies. So in the early part of the 30s, you had, as you know, a Calgary-connected prime minister, R.B. Bennett, and you had a conservative government, and you had a different kind of relationship to the problems that later on Quebec lieutenants would cause for a later prime minister. That's King. So the period, the decade has its kind of shape to it, and there are related issues, but really I was lucky that my story fell in the front half, so from 30 to 35. And I'll read you another tiny section to just give you a portal into that moment. So most of this book actually takes place in Saskatchewan, for those of you who are sitting in a city or a town or a village in Saskatchewan. But it does travel to a few other places for short stints, and one of these is Ottawa, because that's where the immigration regime more or less emanates from. So I'll read you a tiny bit about Ottawa. And in this case, a portrait of a few other influential Jewish guys. My grandfather was not an influential figure, and in what way they related to official Canada, if you know the capital. So this is the beginning of a chapter called Oh, Ottawa. If this were a silent film, then the next part of the story would open with an iris-in shot, the tiny black circle expanding to reveal a silver and white scenario that includes my grandfather aboard a train traveling toward his point of departure on Poland's Baltic coast, the ship setting out for the New World at Southampton, his CNR train departing from the west, at Quebec City as he considers the tin of sardines that he's been given, sans key to wind back its top. Set these views aside for a bit. They await us, these immigrant scenarios that blend heartache and a slapstick kind of unheeding movement forward. They're fun and scary too. But the black circle expands first on a Canadian setting before those above could take place. The setting is Ottawa. The year 1926. And this is a rare occasion. Most of my action takes place very carefully in the period directly associated with my grandfather's activities, 30 to the spring of 35. This is a little before. The year 1926, before the Depression and directly between the world wars, close in on characters worthy of a dramatic scenario, like nothing showing at the time on a Canadian stage. Our stage is the country's parliament with its Gothic byways and towers. All of the players are men, though one woman lurks off stage. As in a Shakespearean tragedy, there are two bitterly opposed sides. On one side are figures of Canadian authority, parliamentary ministers, deputy ministers, immigration commissioners, some wearing high wingtip collars and waistcoats and sporting fulsome moustache. Arrayed against them are men less prone to the moustache, but well tailored all the same. One is a manufacturer of suits in Montreal, another the owner of the biggest department store in Ottawa. These men are representatives of the Canadian Jewish community, leaders of social welfare organizations, success stories from the Montreal and Ottawa business communities. If at the time there was a Jewish Canadian aristocracy, however tiny, these were its male representatives. So this kind of snapshot then kind of presents you with the backdrop for really the main activity of the book, which is my grandfather's writerly efforts, networking efforts, movements around different parts of Saskatchewan to create the context in which he would be able to bring his wife and his two children after him. And the thing that I should show you, and then Aritha might send us back to these, is what the letters looked like as he begins to write off to all the people who he will try to entice into his goals. So here I'll give you a quick look. You're back to me. Looks good. That's the part of Saskatchewan where he was in two places. So that's a good time to say it. So up at the top, if you can see Lipton and naturally Capel, he was at a place called Dysart first, spent a good period of time there. And then he dropped down to the southern border, not so far from the US border, to a place called Hirsch, which is along the railway there. You might see Bienfait and Estevan. So those were his two places to be alone through the period in which he was working on his immigration challenge. Dysart, the pretty plentiful elevators at the time. And here you have one of many Yiddish letters that he begins to write off. And of course, in the case of the Yiddish ones, they're all mostly going to the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, either in Montreal, where it had its head offices, or in Winnipeg, where there was also very effective people who were working on all kinds of files. I'd like to say thousands of files, but certainly numerous hundreds of files. So here he writes from Dysart. He helps us with a little bit of English at the top, really early in the undertakings of trying to solve his challenge, bring his family over. Choshev Frank von immigration, he writes with his nice looking fountain pen hand. Dear friend of immigration, an abbreviation for the Immigrant Aid Society, Jewish Immigrant Aid Society. So the letters are all beautiful and in some ways almost like art. And they always have interferences by the people that dealt with them in the offices. And we don't always know the code, but people know about early documents, might be able to tell me sometimes things. I suppose the strikeout means we dealt with it. That's my guess. But then there'll be notations on these things that you won't necessarily understand. Someone's penciled something in there. And I'll just note one thing and then I'll back out of the share. So if I get a chance, I'll show you a picture of how he looked before he left Poland. He looked plenty modern, but he had very distinct resources in terms of his Jewish literacy, and he retreated into a more traditional identity for any number of reasons. He was taking up jobs in places like Dysart and Hirsch as a kind of an all-purpose religious functionary. And at the top, along with the date, he notes the Torah reading for the week. So he's sort of, he's setting the world by his time in the way that he prepares his letters. So I'll back out. The last thing that I'll do just before Aritha and I get a chance to talk is try to convey in what way this book sets up a kind of a tete-a-tete, a kind of a dramatic interplay between the individual, very wonderful individual once I found out about him. I had not known about him prior to the work on the book, really, and authorities. So Aritha helpfully pointed me back to this short section. This will be the last thing that I read you. So it's only about halfway into the book when I do this, but I do try in this way to kind of take account of what's the full picture we're looking at here as we see the individual at work trying to solve his personal disaster if he can't get it to work, and in what way he's up against certain forces. So what becomes clear as we follow this story, relying on what the archives offer, and recognizing how mainstream Canadian historiography misses stories like that of my grandfather, is that from his outpost near Fort Capel, so that's the first one up at Dysart, with hints here and access to knowledgeable professionals there, he knew what he was doing. He was listening to the experts, but even more importantly, he was asking questions, some repeatedly, and following leads where he found them, which sometimes led him to guide the guiders and move in directions on his own. Part of the reason for this is that my grandfather would not take no for an answer. So it doesn't say it twice in the book, but I'll say it again. He would not take no for an answer. But add to this the fact that the system itself, the immigration regulations and the gatekeepers put in place to control people like him, was a tangle of side roads, back rooms, contradictory viewpoints, leavened to an extent by the ability of those with some access to the gatekeepers to tweak it, to bend it, to make use of its soft spots so that it might serve a particular purpose. This is a Kafkaesque aspect of these Canadian decades, rarely acknowledged. A system of authority, when called upon by an outsider to explain itself, cannot do so. Even more importantly, a system that seems to be an expression of total authority, cynical and unrelenting, is no such thing. It's always in danger of being undermined, some links weakened to the extent that the whole thing rattles apart. This is another point at which the familiar none is too many rubric obscures the story that I want to tell, even if he had heard of such a rule regarding Jews entering Canada from his homeland. My grandfather clearly did not heed it. So there I'll stop, and we can turn in new directions.
What is most wonderful about this story, Norman, is the way that you have depicted your grandfather's tenacity, despite the fact that he was working with and against an incredible, a bizarre Byzantine system. So you talk in the book about the temptation of Canada, this destination that's so carefully vetted by actuaries and politicians and the immigration system. And yet at the same time, I mean, the complexity that your grandfather faced is very similar to the complexity you faced in writing this. So how did you, first of all, come to, I mean, it's obvious that from that wonderful photograph of you as a child that he was someone you loved and obviously had an influence on you. But how did you come, first of all, to begin this project, and then the process of your tackling it with so much acuity and precision, given the fact that you were walking through as many gates and fences, I think, as your grandfather was?
So the thing that I say at the outset, I think is meaningful on my end. The writing I do is so often drawn from family stories, and these are passed down in different ways. But in this case, I did gradually get the sense that the way the family lore operated was entirely incomplete, partial, to some large degree incorrect. And I suppose that only dawned on me with time and a little bit sort of haphazard reading and checking. And so I always had that family story lurking. And I think over the years, what I was doing was sometimes putting his name into the internet to see what would pop up. This was a lazy effort. And for the longest time, really nothing did, aside from his death certificate and this kind of genealogical information that the Mormons are making available to all of us. But then the two archival files eventually popped up, and I can't even remember exactly how. And it did seem kind of like a surprise, as if I'd tried so many times and got nothing. And then suddenly the availability of these two archival files, so full of things like the letter that I had up for you, that proposed a kind of a resource that I'd never had. So, I'd heard about it from my grandmother, I'd heard about it from my mom. Then I had the good fortune of having an uncle who was competent to translate Yiddish handwriting, which I was not. I can translate Yiddish typescript, typeset Yiddish, but the handwriting stopped me dead. And in that way, I garnered a collaborator. My uncle lived in Brooklyn, and it's his dad. So mentioning this also signals how the story ends. But so I should bracket it all. But what then developed between the two of us was a great exchange of letters, always paper. He didn't do email. Translations, they'd arrive, excellently done. And they would also include commentary. And he had a legalistic and kind of academic way of doing those commentaries. So it makes it sound like he wrote the book. It's not the case. But what developed then was this kind of entirely new resource. And I guess once I had that translated two files, one from Montreal, one from Winnipeg, then I started to operate it like a proper researcher. And it did carry on over 10 or more years. So that's an unusually long period of time. Aritha maybe will confirm this or not, but that's a long time to be working on one project. But it was a stop and start process. And then it really demanded visits to the National Archives, which I had never properly visited. And in that way, I had the immigration files that were really oriented towards my grandfather's activities. Then at the archives, you find the immigration branch and all of its, incredibly preserved stuff. Too bad, though, mostly on microfiche. And then starting to put together kind of range of alternates, voices, the authorities' voice from the archives, my grandfather's voices and his compatriots in his own files. And then after that, exactly how the book started to take on its own character and develop a kind of a voice, like I tried to convey in those readings, that I don't recall. But, in answering thinking about your questions and other interviews I've done, somehow I've just been stuck on the need for the personal voice. So it never moved toward a historiographer's voice, and it never needed to become fanciful or fictionalized. But I cannot put my finger on where that decision got made.
You raise a really interesting point, though, that there are archives there are physical archives, papers, letters, and so on, but there's also the archive of human memory. There's the archive of family lore. There is the archive of place, the places where he lived.
Yeah.
And there is, I mean, you're quite right, it eludes any genre description, but there is, I think, the archive of the gaps between what we know about stories.
Yeah. So I was at ease with that, and I maybe never did expect to get the full story. So I won't reveal it tonight. However much percent of the resolution I achieve in the book, but it's pretty good. But I was also at ease with the things that would remain partial. And I have a little section I can read on this in a second. And I held on to that. And I had a couple of people I was talking to in the process of working on the book who always found this kind of annoying and would be looking for the puzzle piece that would solve exactly how the outcome turns. And it just didn't, it didn't bother me. I always wanted to look for as much as I could find, go up all the alleys I could, but I was okay with things that remained a little partial. And then I surely knew the things I would never know.
You know, sorry to interrupt, but it's so interesting because the people who are saying, where's the puzzle piece that fits, couldn't have been writers, because every writer knows that a story is never completed. It is only abandoned.
Fair enough.
Well, maybe they were. But yeah, you pull together, and you do have a wonderful passage about the partial story and how that can open a door at the same time as you have a keen awareness that it is based on a gap, a lacuna, and even an absence.
Right. And some important ones, I have to say, even though the drift of the narrative really starts to resolve things, and the quality of detection is effective and successful, and yet those gaps, they remain important. So I'll read just a tiny bit to open this. It's really short, but it's about the letters. So my grandfather's Dysart letters are handwritten in Yiddish in blue fountain pen ink. This gives them a certain beauty as artifacts. The letters are substantial in length, often running to a second or a third page. The lone English words on them are in their headings, such as, and you saw it, Dysart Sask, 25, January 1932. Many things are missing from my picture. Where did my grandfather sit to write his long and often emotional letters? Where did he find an appropriate desk? Or was a kitchen table the best he had? When he wrote, was there a window before him offering a view of the snowbound or parched landscape? Where did he get his fountain pen and ink? Was the pen a Polish one brought over with him, or something bought in Estevan at Mandel's store when he was in town to meet his lawyer? A cineast would make all this up, but I'm not allowed that freedom. What I tell is what there is. So I really do decide there, or confirm, I think, more or less for myself. That's the kind of book this will be.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that it is so rich and so interesting. It isn't like reading an historical account where all the dates and facts have to be perfectly represented. And you certainly work with a lot of information. What strikes me so powerfully about Who Gets In, Norman, is that you've done so much research, but one of the most difficult challenges that anyone faces who is working within an historical story is, how do you tell this story without having it stink of the research? That's an expression I think I heard from someone else, but it's so often when you read a history that the facts trap the story. How did you evade that?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and that would take too much thought. The photographs that are in it become sort of points of meditation. I mean, so I guess I could, if I show you a little bit more along these lines. back up. The images are there.
Yes.
So everything becomes meditative. Not everything here shows up in the book, but photographs like this, and you take them over time and then investigate them in sort of ways that you wouldn't expect to. So some of these photographs are the originals. So if you flip them over on the back, you can see where the studio was, where they had the photograph taken. So I would do things like, and it was always a pleasure really to find these things out. I would go off and find out who owned that photograph studio. And then you would even find, because this is taken not in the little village I showed you, but in a nearby larger small city, that on the internet now there's this swell of similar kinds of photographs with the same scrim behind it, because the same groupings would show up for their family photograph over the period, I don't know how many years this studio was in action. So some of this kind of work, I guess, it's not the way a fiction writer works. Now I'm going to lose this so that we're looking at each other. But it is the way a writer works to enliven things and not be always kind of building things around, all the details associated with the reading that you're doing. So I guess I was probably always looking for these kinds of portals. And, you find them for the Polish side of the book, and then also for the Saskatchewan stuff and the Ottawa stuff. And then, as you say, the archive associated with going places. So retracing certain parts of my grandfather's trajectory so that it was enlivened in my mind. The prairies, especially, Saskatchewan especially, and then the life of Ottawa in that period. So I'm just in some ways beginning to riff on the ways that you hopefully know what the hell you're talking about, which is always a worry. And then you try to find ways to leaven it or open it. So photographs are, and they're important in the book. And I'll say one more thing before I stop. So the publisher was so suitable in this case, University of Regina Press, in the sense that a few things I could say. One, they have a series which is not an academic series, and my book is in it. And that meant that they were entertaining these kinds of different, strategies. And though they knew they were receiving a well-researched manuscript, they weren't telling me, hey, it's got this kind of sassy tone to it sometimes. It's not appropriate. So I was able to, have the book that as it was and the publisher run with it. And then we also thought about ways, this was my impetus really, to, okay, we've got footnotes, but put them at the back, different ways to build the book so that if you want to read it and never ever look at those notes, you can. And they're not notes full of the way academics like to do, detailed sub-material. So also in the way of building the book, how it holds in your hand, pushing those things back so that these other characteristics would come to the fore.
That's so apt because it's true. Footnotes are a curse. I really think they should be banned in all cases because it introduces an academic tone that presupposes that your reader doesn't follow you.
Right.
And what you were doing, I hope I'm not crossing a line, is you were following your grandfather's story. You were following your grandfather's journey and his journey. And in the course of it, of course, you perform a journey across time, Canada, a certain historical period. Right. And of course, the whole, it's so rich. There's so much here about going to the prairies and single men and the way the railroad was willing to carry them. And that whole notion of the journey to a place they didn't know at all. So your persistence, it seems to me, demonstrates by refusing footnotes a greater fealty to your grandfather's character than you had tried to represent him so precisely.
It's a nice thought. So I had not thought of that, of course, but that lets, all the things you led me to say previously, lets him rise to the fore. And probably I was struggling to do that because one of the many challenges was I didn't know him. I can't write a memoir of him the way you do of a parent or grandparent that you remember and know well. And I'd heard about him, but it appeared once this story became clear to me that so much of what I'd heard about his undertakings was like just the details. It didn't take shape. So in what way to get him to come forward? That you said it better than I can. Yeah. And then a related issue was how much of me could be in the book. And I didn't want too much of me. Although I'm the detective, so I have to be in it. But you mostly meet his trajectory. You do meet my trajectory in search of his. So there's a mirroring quality to that. There, I become his. I'm in pursuit. I'm chasing him.
A work of detection. That's really nice.
Yeah.
You raise really important questions of origin, of who gets to name origin, of how a country's laws and bureaucrats and border clerks assert naming, and sometimes naming that is in no way very accurate. Can you, I think that's where I see traces in reading this of you, questions of origin and how we are in this amazing, lucky country, all of us, in a very strange relationship to our origins.
So it's really important in the book, and it's got these bookends in Poland. So the origin is really, it's dramatic, and I want to portray it with care. And then in terms of the question of what was done to people's names and what was done to their identity in that period in more dramatic ways, I'll say something more trivial and then something more related to the book itself. So the quirk in my family's case is, this is on my dad's side, not my mom's side, is that we came from Russia with our distinctive name, and we got in with it, the two V's, and no one said, what's this nonsense? You don't need these two V's. So I and my kids are fortunate. We retain this name that goes back to imperialist Russia. So that's one way of thinking about this in my family. Then on the side of my grandfather, I have one of the images in the book is the government return form, as they called it, for all people who sailed from different European ports. And because it's so low tech, it includes all this handwritten information. And these were big sheets, and the name is here and it's transliterated in a funny way. That may have been part of the problem of finding documentation. Why am I doing this? At certain points. And then there's a lot of information in columns across the way. And the most remarkable thing on our case, you don't see it that often, is that under nationality or race, so this is an issue that was really in play at the time, and my book struggles to deal with how nobody knew what they meant by these terms. You go down the column to hit my grandfather, and someone started to put Polish. And then nicely for us, the artifact shows the strikeout. I think there's a P and almost then a bit of an O in favor of Hebrew. So this is nonsense, and it's a way of shredding somebody's identity. And it was so related, of course, to the way that the immigration regulations worked. And we haven't said much about it, and maybe we should avoid it because it's so complicated. But the Hebrews were among the very special cases in terms of what the Canadian Immigration Department was allowing or disallowing. And they didn't want to think of my grandfather's Polish background or his very ecumenical Polish passport. And so one of my long-term games was to look at passports all through that period. Of course, I don't have his passport, which didn't signify anything about religion or anything about race. The Poles were way ahead of us in 1930. It just said his nationality and it noted that he was incorrectly single. So it had to do with nativeness, if that word still works, and then married status, and then. I always found the mark on the government return form such dramatic evidence of how all the way down at this low level of a guy that notes the page when you get on the ship, writes a few numbers and initials it. He says to you, "You're finished. Your Polish nationality is gone. It's evaporated. You know what you are now? You're a Hebrew." And then even for at the time, the Canadians are funny because they're using this archaic word that Jews would not use about themselves. So it's that's the long story of exactly what is a Jew to some other non-Jews, this archaic thing out of the Bible. So the whole game is so complex and bad. And it sort of it puts a nice introductory kind of note on what he's going to have to deal with as he deals with the immigration department and other kinds of civil service types.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that I think it's so fascinating is that his chameleonic ability, which is necessary for him to survive. And his story is almost a rare paradox, right? Because his personal adaptation, and that moment in the 30s, I mean, it's a terrible time for people suffering from the Depression, but how he kind of transforms himself at given moments into what is necessary in order to pursue his dreams and his desires, and that is, of course, to be reunited with his family. So do you think his story is a rare paradox, or and you talk about this so beautifully in the book, does his personal adaptation reveal how little we understand of the transformation of identity in Canada's peculiar Kafkaesque immigration system?
So these are things, of course, that I only learned in the process of studying his story. And I like this idea that there's these alternate options of it being kind of paradoxical. That's the word that you put in my mind. And then I thought of quixotic, the idea of something that kind of just springs out of nowhere or anywhere. But then two, the other side of what you've just raised, that, the reality is these are the kinds of stories that we just haven't tended to know or hear. And his is particular in certain ways, maybe because of the kind of immigrant that he ended up being. That is this kind of unusual religious functionary, playing this kind of organizational role in small rural places. So he had a certain kind of, let's say, talismanic quality that a man driving a bread truck couldn't have. And I don't mean that in any kind of, critical way. So he got a break, let's say. And the reality is that if he had stayed in Poland, he would not have become the kind of the community-oriented figure that he became in these small Canadian places. So the thing I thought you were going to ask is, did he know what he was doing? And I think the answer to that is no. I don't really think so.
Does any immigrant know what they're doing?
So this is a way of answering to your question. I mean, I think this is about fast movement, fast on your feet, a certain degree of good, quick thinking and strategizing. And then the thing that's added to him, and I don't know if this falls under the paradoxical or just the other thing, the quality of everything we just don't know, we just have these stereotypic ideas of how these stories work out, is not just the persistence, but the persistence in many directions, going off in many directions. And this was part of the thing that overwhelmed, as I try in that little section I read, that overwhelmed the system, because there was layers that were operating well to block him and silence him and stop him. But then he moved on to other layers, and those tended to be the elected figures rather than the civil servants. and those people were more porous. They like those balloons kids punch. They bounced, and then he came back again. And so I don't know. This is not really paradoxical. This is something else, isn't it? It's existential, or I don't know. It's the full personality operating in some way. Yeah.
Well, as you said right at the beginning, he doesn't give up. When he meets a roadblock, he goes around it, and then he finds another way around it. And that is so telling, because it's an indication of the kind of passion that an individual can bring to, even in the face of a bureaucratic wall.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know the bureaucratic wall. There are still plenty of them out there. But your examination of his, it isn't just determination, it's much more. It's a kind of incredible, okay, this won't work, but I'll try this.
Right. And I like the idea that there's only one where he stepped over the line. That is the lie. That could have got him, that got other people deported. And they were deporting a lot of people in this period, Jews and non-Jews, sending them to the UK, sending them to Eastern Europe. Sometimes if they were Marxists, sometimes if they were on the dole. I don't think he was in real danger of deportation because of this particular sort of place he found himself in, these small communities where any, maybe not the civil servants, but the elected officials, they viewed a figure like this as helpful. He's contributing to, we don't say it anymore with the glee we used to, the settlement of the West. He's in the late stages of it, but he's holding these little villages together by way of his activities. So that the early transgression of the lie was his one, you could say, real risk. But that did not, I don't think that really presented a threat ultimately.
Well, the whole question of lying or truth telling, I mean, because they were only accepting single men, why would he say, if he was determined to go, that he was married? There is often the utilization in these different origin stories of the beautiful lie, the necessary lie, and his role in those small communities. And I mean, this man worked really hard.
Right.
I mean, that in itself is almost mind-boggling, how hard he must have worked.
And the other thing about it that I have I'm on the long list of things that I have no information about, is what it would have been like to be there, having left it all behind, a fairly cosmopolitan life, full-scale community. You appear in this landscape entirely unknown to you, but then you do find some people who are like you. So this is kind of the neat thing about these ethnic settlement blocks in Saskatchewan especially, but elsewhere on the prairies, where, he shows up alone, but boy, they prize him because he's just the kind of guy that a little community needs. And in that way, they'll do everything to keep him. And the move from Dysart down to Hirsch was a step up, because the Hirsch colony, as they called it, was a bigger community. And it had a much longer established kind of farming history, and kind of more support from different Jewish organizations in places like Montreal. So that's a place at which he moves out of the real hinterlands into a place where his ability to network improves. Although the job remains the same. He's koshering meat, he's leading all the religious services, he's teaching all these kids, he's marrying, and he'll bury. And the only thing he does not do ritually is circumcise. So he was all purpose up to that point, so in terms of his hardworking status. But if you needed to circumcise, you would bring somebody in from Regina or Yorkton. So he had all the other roles. And then some of the fun things that I found in the process of the research were in Yiddish newspapers from the period. So he seemed to have found or thought that it was his responsibility to write off to the Winnipeg Yiddish Press and say, "Gotta let you know, we just had this wonderful bar mitzvah here in Dysart, and let me tell you who was at the party, and the feast was terrific," and on it goes. So in those little newspaper plugs for the things that are going on in these little places, he's conveying to the metropolis, "Don't forget us. This is how we live. We're doing things that you respect. We're maintaining an observant life the way you hope to." So those were great finds and kind of serendipitous, really. Can't even remember how I did it.
It's interesting part clearly of his ability and his tenacity was his literacy.
Yes. So that takes you back to the early pages of the book where I try to describe his education, which was in part at a Hasidic shtibel, as they called it there, which was a kind of a court. And that's a very high level of Jewish Talmudic and ritual study. But then the literacy somehow broadened out, and I don't know enough about that.
But Norman, he was also in the Polish army, right?
Right. So that's an interesting kind of, sub-period in his life. And I have a wonderful photograph, but I don't think I included in the ones I gathered. So he spent a good period as an officer's assistant in Warsaw. And in that way, his timing was good because lots of Poles ended up on the Russian front, but he was a little after that. And from what we had in the family, if it's correct, and that's not in the book because I didn't even trust it, there was a good relationship. The Polish officer was a good guy. And the outcome then of that period is a further kind of cosmopolitanism that came out of the city life, which wasn't naturally where he would have been, but maybe when you see the modernness of how his wife looks in that picture with kids, that was their direction, maybe, if they hadn't left Poland, a Polonizing direction, I think.
But didn't you think that perhaps serving as an officer's assistant taught him a lot about bureaucracies?
Absolutely. But I don't know what he did. I don't, he was told to do things. We know that. Polish boots. I don't know. Write letters.
No, I don't think he was a boot polisher. He seems like he would be writing the memos and right. The officer would sign them.
Memos is good. Go get me the newspapers. These different kinds of somewhat lackey-like responsibilities, but in a very heightened and interesting context in interwar Poland. Yeah.
But in many ways, it's all the accidents and coincidences of people's lives and experiences. But his writing, and I think that you said somewhere, writing letters of woe and supplication to immigration service people and to government figures and to lawyers and to, I don't know. I am speculating. I'm inventing the character that I read in the pages of your wonderful book, but it all comes together. His willingness to document, he's telling the story of the community, his past and how he's gathered that, and his idea of when you must force the truth on people and when you perhaps need to indulge in a
and writing as a terrific tool for that. However conscious he must have been, of course, he'd be conscious of it. And of course, there's the translation issue, which always lurks. But the role there is played so importantly by the Jewish immigrant aid people, and these are undertold figures, I must say. And the fellow who ran the organization here in Montreal is hardly researched at all, and he's difficult to find out about. And there's a really interesting character who was in the same role, and my grandfather constantly wrote to him in Winnipeg. Ended up an alderman, interesting kind of political role there in the city more broadly. And those people were his intermediaries, of course, and they all went to Ottawa, so that his letters were, in a sense, the trigger or the tool, and then the file fattens, and his own ideas and efforts develop. And then those two men that I'm thinking of, Montreal and Winnipeg, they do encounter the immigration minister and other kinds of deputy ministers. So it's the way that the letters filter up, even though the people with authority don't ever see those letters. They would look at them and have no comprehension. But the letters have this kind of, they carry through. They have an interesting way of carrying through. Yeah.
Yeah, the material that you include about, because it's true that the dominant narrative is still none is too many. And the way that you look at the other possibilities and the other narratives and the people who work so assiduously to be, just to help people. It's called helping people, right?
So there you remind me to say a word about the one female who gets mentioned in that piece that I read. And I'll risk it and I'll see if I can show you an image in a sec. This is Lillian Freeman. So it's entirely a book of men, aside from the background story that there is a spouse and a daughter who's supposed to come from Poland, but the players are all males, except for Lillian Freeman, who's this incredibly well-connected and activist-oriented person in Ottawa, who has friendships with all the right people and contacts all the way up to both prime ministers. She was a better friend of King than of Bennett, but she had access to Bennett. And if you look at other stories, it kind of goes back to your question of paradoxical versus narratives we just don't really know. She followed up on narratives like my grandfather's again and again and again, and she often solved them. And in my case, I must tell you that we don't know exactly where she fits, though she's important for sure. And this will be the last thing I show you, and then maybe we're sort of coming close to our endpoints. Let me just show you Lillian, and then say maybe one. Are we back on images? Yep. Okay, here we go. We run through. Not very high tech. There she is. So the house is still on Somerset Street. She's sitting at her wonderful desk. Who knows where that desk went? It may be that in 1934, when my grandfather was getting desperate and wrote to her, this is where she read the letter. I don't know. And I was able to get inside the house, which is now the Canadian Army's officers' mess, with some historical markings that show that it was once the home of Lillian and Archie Freeman. But then I got kicked out because the reality is it's a private, I don't know, the website didn't look like it was private, but I got the material I needed. So this is a key figure who we didn't say anything about till now, and I'll stop sharing. And she's important in the late stages of the narrative, but it's one of the, as you say, gaps where the full clarity doesn't quite come into focus. But she's crucial. She's crucial.
Yeah, and that so often happens is someone behind the scenes works so hard to move those miserable pieces of paper forward. The photograph is amazing. I mean, you can see the date. It says the 2nd. I couldn't, but just the very desk, the lamp, but also candles.
Yeah. Yeah, and the books behind, these kind of whatever they are, these leather-bound books. It would be, if you could only tease out all the details of this photograph, which I have not done. I have not done.
I think there's a project for you, Norman. You need to write a book about her.
She's undertold among the different things in the book that came clear, and she does in a couple of chapters. I call the chapter "Enter the Great Lady," which is a translation from the way the Yiddish journalists wrote about her. And she needs to be better told. Yeah.
Well, you do have the other figures, women. And what did one letter refer to your grandmother as, because he had lied about being single or being single when he was married, but is determined. one of the letters says something about his determination. I'm trying to remember it. I'm sorry. To unite with his alleged wife and children. And
It's
I thought, they're
dirty.
not alleged, they're real.
It's dirty. And, you know, you say that, it's a bit like your point about naming and identity shredding. I mean, you say that about a story you're telling. It's your family, is it? And then the thing really takes on this grubby quality. You may just be making this up for whatever absurd reason. And thankfully, that dirty stuff shows up in the context of letters from immigration commissioners, and they don't end up being the real deciders. They would like to be, but in our case, they don't end up being. So that use of that kind of slurring and stuff is at that level, and he gets past it, goes beyond it. Yeah, your alleged wife.
He goes around it, yeah. And in the end, the politicians are actually more helpful than the bureaucrats, which is interesting because I think it's probably reversed now.
Yeah, so that's an interesting test, and people have asked me, and I don't know enough about the contemporary authority and structure to know how different it is. But I believe you're probably right. You might be right.
I don't know either.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but
it's the wonderful, and this will be my last question to you, and I'll let you close maybe with a short passage, is that it strikes me that this book, this beautiful book, is really about the extent to which Canada has grown rich on those who won't take no for an answer.
well, I like it. Say more. Help me with that. Say a tiny bit more.
Well, as you know, we're constantly welcoming or not welcoming newcomers, and that complex story of this nation. I mean, the original peoples, the indigenous story, and the way that over and over again these other newcomers, migrants have entered into this story. But in many ways, Canada has been built on that foundation of people who won't take no for an answer. And you know what? I include Indigenous people in that.
Well, I like that. And you helped me then mention something that this book did struggle with. And it's to a degree the influence of my other half, who's an anthropologist and a Canadianist in ways different than I am. I'm not an anthropologist. In that she wanted to know if the territory, you know, the trouble of the settlement of the West and the place of the Jewish newcomer in it could have a touch point with Indigenous lives. And in that way, my book doesn't try to be about this, but it tries to let it enter when it can. And in that way, consider the Jewish newcomer's knowledge and maybe sensitivity to the things that were going on around him in terms of very nearby to my grandfather, a couple of very big, long-established residential schools. Yeah. And it's an interesting challenge in your mind because, like the other things that Aritha's pointed us to, I don't have any evidence that he comprehended these things. But I did want them to, in some ways, be compatriots, and maybe moving in opposite directions in the sense that his arrival and his involvement in these small places showed a forward movement, although he was retreating in tradition toward tradition, while the Cree atmosphere was deteriorating around him. So that, you know, I won't read, but I think that his narrative in that way sort of, it moves near to the narrative that we're hearing about every day right now. And in what way Canada can see things or not see things. That may be a proper thing to say, that there's a shared quality there. In what way I try to figure out how was he seen? How this this unusual undertaking and character and kind of newcomer? How is he seen? And I try to, in some ways, contrast with the way that the Indigenous people in his surroundings were also seen. So they become sort of, in that way, I hope, compatriots, ways of opening stories up.
And how in many ways what every person faces is the structural blindness that will put obstacles in the paths of
Right.
just people who are trying to do their best with their lives and their families.
Right. Yeah.
That's a sad note to end on, but it is a wonderful book, and you don't have to read footnotes to read it.
No, you do not.
Thank you so much, Norman, for the richness and the beauty of this book, and for its wonderful, it is like reading a detective story.
Thanks, Aritha.
Well, I'll just say a quick word before I let you go. I'd like to thank you both for being with us tonight and sharing your evening with us. And I'd also like to thank Melissa Shirley from University of Regina Press for working with us to create this event. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Who Gets In, please come in to McNally Robinson, give us a call, or place an order on our website, mcnallyrobinson.com, or order from your local indie bookstore if you're out of the province. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Please take care.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you.